We all need to individualize training programs for powerlifters, simply due to individual differences. But what does that mean in practice? Does that mean that every program needs to be unique? How do we individualize exercise selection and training dose? In this video, I will go through what the principle of individualization is, how the individualization process works, and how we can approach choosing exercise selection and training dose to fit the individual. Now, if you're new here, my name is Norman Chung, and I've been coaching powerlifters to compete internationally for over 12 years. So what is individualization? Among the many training principles out there, including overload, specificity, and others, individualization is one of the core principles necessary to create effective training for individual lifters. Now, this principle dictates considerations that you need to implement in program design and coaching. It recognizes that even though everyone doing powerlifting must do common activities in a gym, which is driven by the specificity principle, everyone who does lift carries aspects to them that are unique to each individual. It recognizes that there are individual differences, hence the name individualization. These differences can occur in several key areas: biological differences, training background, lifestyle constraints, and psychological variations, just to name a few. However, these are referred to as interpersonal individual differences. One thing that you do need to know is that a single individual can be different to themselves across time. Through the means of adaptation, circumstantial changes, an individual becomes a different profile over time. This is intrapersonal individual differences. And this individualization process helps us take the individual's unique data that we see and turn it into meaningful information that helps guide our decisions when it comes to tailoring the program. So what makes a program individualized? Well, the program must be relevant to the individual's goals, constraints, and characteristics while being optimal enough to drive the desired adaptations. Fundamentally, this program needs to be more relevant to the individual for it to be more optimal, not just making a unique program for unique sake. So let's look at the types. Individualization is the process of making programming decisions around bits of information. When we come across information that we want to individualize a program around, we can do it two ways. We can do it proactively or reactively. Proactively means we've spotted this observation about an athlete. We must make an active programming decision now. A good example of this would be a change in training availability. It's a super obvious change in context that requires us to program around these new constraints. Reactively individualizing a program means that we've spotted something that may have practical implications with programming. However, it requires some further qualifying information to confirm whether we should actively make decisions around it or not. A good example of this is programming someone while they're on a calorie deficit. It may well have strong implications with their work capacity, but it might not at all. Why is it important to distinguish between the two? Because if we can distinguish between the two, we can be more efficient with our time and energy, and more importantly, make better coaching decisions. If we prematurely make a programming change around an observation, we may end up making bad decisions. Another good example is the programming of female athletes. There's this common but not unfounded idea that how female lifters can deal with slightly higher doses of volume or intensity on the bench press. So the problem with making an assumption from the get-go is that you may well end up dealing with an outlier that you didn't realize about. So you don't necessarily want to assume that just because there's this quality about this athlete that you necessarily need to make these preemptive decisions about the training. So the process of creating an individualized program is made up of two initial processes: an initial needs analysis and ongoing monitoring. Monitoring being the iterative process of analyzing the changing needs of the athlete over time. So let's talk about what the needs analysis is. So a needs analysis looks at the needs of the sport as well as the needs of the athlete. So let's assume that we already have a good understanding of what the needs of the chosen disciplines are, whether it's full power, bench press only, classic, or equipped. We can then dedicate our focus on just looking at the needs of the athlete. The needs analysis is all about profiling the athlete with as much necessary and relevant information as possible. Now, relevant and necessary information is what will enable the coach to be able to prescribe training in an informed way as much as possible. At the end of the day, the training prescription needs to do two main things: prevent injury and enhance performance. But what information is going to be needed to help the program design anyways? Well, you need to include the following elements, but not limited to: physical profile. So this may include height, weight, anthropometry, biological age, and general build. Their psychological profile, including motivation levels, perceived barriers, as well as their preconceptions. You can look at their training background, including training in other sports, experience lifting, and experience powerlifting specifically. This is going to include looking at previous training programs that athletes have done before in the past, which will help you individualize the training dose later on. Training constraints, including equipment access, lifestyle, training availability, taking into considerations of energy levels around available times. You will also want to look at their history of injuries, including current or past injuries, whether they're related to lifting or not. One major predictor of future injuries is actually looking at past injuries. It's also worth looking at what training was like around those injuries as well. You also want to pay attention to see if there's any overuse injuries, because the chances are there is a possibility that the training dose probably contributed to that. You also want to look at a performance history, including the training best as well as competition best, looking at trends in performance of each individual lift and the nature of competition frequency. You also want to understand the performance goals, including competition-specific goals as well as lift-specific goals. Once you've built your needs analysis, you can really build a big picture of where this athlete is and what you're dealing with. So let's talk about what program monitoring is. So the ongoing process of monitoring training response is the process of individualizing around intrapersonal differences. Remember, when athletes adapt to training, they literally become a different lifter, meaning that they hold different athlete profile and their response to training is likely to change at some point. Now, within ongoing monitoring, this will involve looking at two things, which is the performance trend as well as the effects of excess fatigue. So this will involve collecting data on performance metrics, including E1RM, like PB loads and so on, recovery markers, and subjective feedback to make informed decisions about programming adjustments. Through effective monitoring, you can identify when reactive individualization is needed and make data-based decisions to optimize the training progress. So let's move on to talk about the elements of programs that we need to individualize, specifically the exercise selection and training dose. So let's start off with the individualization of exercise selection, specifically variations of the main three lifts. When thinking about exercise variation, we can visualize each possible variation being on a specificity spectrum. On one end, we have absolute competition specificity, and on the other end, we have a lot of variability. Now, we can't be all on competition specificity all the time, otherwise we may risk plateauing earlier or even risk overuse issues. But at the same time, we can't all be on the other end of the spectrum of having no specificity, because then we would hold back some exposure and practice to get us good for being able to perform on competition day. And so somewhere along the spectrum is a hypothetical group of viable options that give the athlete the biggest return on investment in progress. Now, these exercises that give the biggest transfer effects to competition performance progress is said to have the most dynamic correspondence. So an exercise's ability directly affected athlete's sporting performance is dynamic correspondence. You can also refer to it as transferability as well. So the better options for variations will replicate the biomechanical, psychological, and physiological demands of the competition lifts. As coaches, we can use reason, logic, and reflect upon past successes to determine our selection. An old saying goes, you are only as strong as your weakest link. So we can use reason and logic to choose variations that target the lifter's weaknesses. Now, when thinking about weaknesses in powerlifting, we can break them down into several categories. So there can be technical weaknesses, which refer to like poor positioning or setup. There could be physical weaknesses, which may refer to like physical strength or capacity deficits. So this might mean that they can hold a good position like early on in a set, but then their muscles fatigue very early on and the form breaks down. It could be limited mobility. It could be mental weaknesses, lacking confidence at certain intensities, inconsistent execution under pressure. It can also be movement-specific weaknesses, so sticking points in specific ranges of motion, poor force production in specific ranges. With that said, we can take the observed weaknesses and decide upon two different types of variations that I personally refer to as kinetic variations and kinematic variations. So kinetic variations are variations that differ in the way that we express force through the repetition. For example, implementing tempo or paused variations. And then kinematic variations are variations that differ in the movement pattern. For example, like high bar squats or front squats. And you can individualize your variations through the selection with one or both of these types of variations. So you might want to choose kinetic variations if you believe that the lifter needs that movement pattern specificity, but need to address or reinforce a technique issue or sticking point. For example, if the lifter has a hard time rushing the deadlift off the floor, you may well give them a pause deadlift or a tempo to knee deadlift. Or if someone has a sticking point at the knee during the conventional deadlifts, you may well give them pause deadlifts. On the other hand, you may choose kinematic variations if you either want to change their movement pattern in their competition lift, i.e. change the way they execute their main lift, or if too much specificity in a programming is causing too much pathology such as pain or discomfort. A really good example is someone who hinges their squats. You may give them something like a high bar squat or a front squat. Or someone who finds too much low bar squat gives them issues around their shoulders. You may want to give them something like a safety bar squat. But there are also some other considerations that you need to take into account as well, which include their anthropometry or limb length, which may dictate whether a variation is suitable for them or not, their body size, their personal preference, the availability, the learning curve of that variation, load and implications of that variation. For example, some variations may be inherently load limiting, and also their personal preference as well. So let's talk about individualization of the training dose. How do we individualize the training dose? Now let's break it up into how we individualize the training dose for an initial period of training and how we individualize the training dose over time. So the process of individualizing an initial period of training can depend on the lifter that you are dealing with. If you are dealing with a novice lifter, you also need to consider, are you dealing with someone who is a novice in powerlifting or lifting in general? One thing worth understanding is that just because you are individualizing a program doesn't mean that every program that you write for every individual needs to be vastly different from each other. This is fundamentally the reason why lots of people respond well initially to cookie cutter programs, especially if they are beginner or intermediate programs. So someone who has not lifted before needs to focus on technical proficiency and better coordination. So it's very likely that you're going to be starting off with someone with low intensity, absolute and relative, as well as more conservative levels of volume. Reason why that is because they are new to lifting and they should deal with loads where they are able to focus on technique more. If the volume intensity is too hard, they're less able to focus on technique control and more on just focusing on just getting a weight up. However, if you are dealing with an experienced lifter and you are designing the first block of the training with this lifter, you need to reflect upon the context on how they came about with working with you in the first place. So the questions that you want answers for is, did they approach you for getting coaching for the first time and that they were self-coached or hopped on cookie cutter programs before? Did they move on from one coach to another? And if that is the case, why did they move on from the previous coach? If they eventually plateaued from whatever they were doing before, how long have they plateaued for? And when was the last time that they made really good progress? You need to analyze and gather data to get clues as to what may have happened, whilst taking into consideration of the context of externals and body weight as well. Now, if you want to use a tool that I use to analyze past training programs, click on the link below in the description box. Now, it's useful to get the lifter's theory as to why they may have plateaued. Was there a shift towards a training dose, towards a certain direction, or did the training actually remain relatively similar? Now, using these answers to these questions, you can then build up a picture of the athlete's current status and build a theory as to what you think may have happened for them to plateau or even lose strength. So you make the best decisions that you can based on the information that you have. The first program that you design may not necessarily grant you the progress that you want to see straight away. There's a saying that goes, plans are nothing, but planning is everything. What this quote really means is that whatever you plan, you will be obliged to deviate in response to changing circumstances in real time. Which brings me on to the next important part, which is how we individualize the training dose over time. Now, if we run an initial training block, things that we want to pay attention to is whether there are days or weeks where certain lifts are feeling particularly strong. So one thing that you want to look at is how the sequence of sessions influence the performance of subsequent training sessions. And this would give you an idea of what the athlete might benefit from. So what you can do is take these insights into consideration to help optimize future training blocks. Let's take a simple example. Now, if you run a 6-week block and in the first 4 weeks, the lifter makes really good progress, but the lifter crashes from fatigue in the last 2. There are a couple things that you could try, which is the first one is to extend how much the lifter is exposed to the stimulus that is similar to the first 4 weeks. Alternatively, you could decide to cut the training block short in future training blocks. So I hope you guys found that video useful. If you liked the video, click like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys on the next one.